Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to discuss works by authors who I have read a fair amount of different things that they've written, and some of them have turned out to be masterpieces for me, or at the very least things that I really liked, and then the other ones have a little bit been flops. And I feel like describing things as masterpiece to flops can sound rather aggressive, so I do want to elaborate that I don't mean by any means that objectively these authors, they reached their peak, they wrote amazing fantasy, and then they lost their spark and they've lost their touch and everything else is garbage in comparison. That's not what I mean whatsoever. This is more an examination on how one, from an individual standpoint, even though something can work for us so well, and you attribute that to the author, their authorial voice, the way they tell a story, the pacing, the character development, you attribute it to that, but then they could do a lot of those things really similarly in a different story, and then it turns out it doesn't work, and it's just kind of commentary on how all of us are such different readers, and what works and what doesn't work. It can be the tiniest bit of difference, and suddenly that little speck of dust, the thing that's kind of making the cog in the machine not really function the same. It's just amazing how it can just be the tiniest difference. And then additionally, I find myself oftentimes, when I have this experience, if I like something by an author, but I don't like something else, sometimes it's not a matter of, in this area it worked, in this area it didn't. Sometimes the author is choosing to pursue a different subgenre, a different writing style, so thus it truly is drastically different across the different works that they're writing or the different series they're writing. And when that happens, the thing I find myself frequently saying is that I really appreciate when authors take chances, because of course the kind of comfortable and safe thing to do is to just kind of deliver upon whatever made you find success in the first place. I'm not saying that necessarily it's wrong when you find an author where you always know what you're going to get with them. I'm not saying that that's somehow a lesser form of storytelling or creating art. Rather, it's just that you are genuinely taking a chance. What worked for you in the past, if you pursue that again, there's a higher likelihood that it's going to continue to work for you. And it is scary to take the plunge and try something different. It might not work whatsoever, but I still really respect when authors do make those leaps and they do take those chances. So while, again, it sounds aggressive to say masterpiece to flop as a kind of general way to categorize this, it's more so saying either I can be picky from one thing to the next, or I actually wanted to highlight when something hasn't worked for me versus when it did, as a way to complement the fact that the author took those chances. So on that note, we're going to go through 6 different authors where I have tried multiple works by them, some of which really ended up fitting my tastes and others that did not. Jumping into it, the first example would be Anthony Ryan. I have read Bloodsong by Anthony Ryan, and I have read The Pariah by Anthony Ryan, and this more so fits within the camp of a lot of what I loved about Bloodsong was still present within The Pariah. I just didn't like The Pariah. So this is not a we totally went a different direction, but rather the smallest of shifts shifted how I felt about it. So Bloodsong, if you don't know, it follows this young man named Valen, and we do have that setup that we get on occasion where a character is telling you their life story to some degree. And you see that established at the beginning of the book, and then you're diving into Valen from the time he's a young boy as he grows into a man, and specifically the majority of this story is through his time at this place where I always described it as it's basically like you're making these young children into the most elite of soldiers, and thus they go through really intense training. They're isolated from basically the rest of the world. They only have their instructors and each other. So it's very harsh. The conditions are unforgiving, and some of the boys do die. So you're kind of looking at the survival of the fittest. We truly only want the top of the top. And Valen's story throughout that, it's not necessarily always the most exciting, it's not the most explosive, it is a much more quiet character examination, and I really loved it. And it helped that I really loved Valen as a character. I adored him. I really enjoyed getting to see the way that you initially have certain views about some of the children, and then as the story progresses, your feelings about them change. As they grow into men, they grow into very different men, and it also can kind of highlight how sometimes your circumstances can produce very different people, even when the circumstances surrounding you and your environments are somewhat similar. So then there's the question of, like, the environment does contribute to the development of these people, but then how much of the past that they couldn't leave behind before they came to this place impacts them, and then also their own personalities. And then also, how does this fit in once they are growing into men and they are expected to be these loyal soldiers? How do they fit into the rest of society? So I loved Bloodsong. I thought it was phenomenal. The Pariah is following a character who is initially finding himself within this kind of ragtag group of people, and then something happens to them, and then he is imprisoned, and then you kind of just follow his journey as he sort of kind of keeps being associated with people who hold power, but he himself doesn't really hold power. You're just kind of watching him as he observes a lot of interesting things going on with other people. It reminds me a lot, actually, of Assassin's Apprentice, because I do feel like there's a similarity there, where it's almost this lack of agency, and you feel for the character because that can really highlight sometimes the ways in which we feel trapped within our own lives. I don't necessarily think that that was absent from Bloodsong. I think it was just more of a stronger feature with this character, because in Bloodsong, he doesn't have the most amount of agency as he's growing up, but you are just kind of looking at him and you're looking at his story. Whereas with this character, he is kind of watching other people who, I'm going to say something similar to what I said before, but then reshape it to, I found their stories so much more interesting that I was like, can I just follow them though? And I thought that the writing styles in both were similar. I really liked the writing quite a bit. I think it has slightly a more formal tone, and then when the occasional funny thing will happen, it actually stands out quite a bit. So I really liked the writing. I just didn't really like this character as much as I liked Valen, and I didn't really like his plot, that he was more of an observer to than what was going on with Valen. But I still would recommend The Pariah for anybody who thinks it sounds good, and especially if you're a fan of Assassin's Apprentice and Robin Hobb in general. I think there's a chance that you would like how Anthony Ryan tells stories as well. Next up, we have Naomi Novik. So we're kind of switching gears here, and on that note, we're also looking at an author who also switches gears. So I specifically have picked up the Temeraire series, I have picked up Spinning Silver, and I have picked up Uprooted. And Temeraire to Spinning Silver and Uprooted are very different. I have not read the more dark academia type story. I haven't gotten into that one just yet. I know that Naomi Novik, at the time that I'm recording this, has another book coming out pretty soon. I'm excited to check that one out. But Naomi Novik has really told different stories from one series to the next. If you don't know, Temeraire is alternate history where dragons are essentially the Air Force during the Napoleonic eras, which is such a cool concept. And then Spinning Silver and Uprooted are more fairy tale retellings. So I really appreciate that this author takes chances. Interestingly, though, from Temeraire to Spinning Silver, I liked both of those. It was in the fairy tale retellings, which are more like each other, that I didn't like one to the next. So it's almost like Naomi Novik represents both concepts that we're describing here. I read Uprooted first. I didn't care for it. I didn't like the character. I didn't like really basically any of the characters. And I didn't feel as invested in the environment, the setting. I just never found myself really gripped by what was happening. In fact, a lot of times I was irritated, and as we went from one place to the next, I just found myself more and more being like, geez, now we're here. And it's not like it was done poorly. I really didn't care about this character and her story and the other characters. So after I didn't necessarily care for that, then I had so many of you tell me, I didn't really like Uprooted either. I love Spinning Silver. I really think there's a chance that you would like it. And I was like, okay, I'm going to take your word for it. A lot of you don't necessarily lead me astray. I trust your judgment here. And I picked up Spinning Silver, and I love Spinning Silver. It's one of my favorite standalones. I think it's absolutely incredible. I love all the ways that the characters are portrayed in that. I think so many of them are so resilient, and they're so motivating, and the way that they kind of end up sort of looking out for each other, sometimes incidentally through other things that they're doing, but then other times very intentionally so. And the environment this time, the setting, I thought was established really fantastically. I just really felt like I had my feet on the ground and I was in it with them. I thought that the way that the cold is portrayed, the way that the atmosphere of how people treat each other was devastating. All of it was fantastic. I think Spinning Silver is amazing. So Uprooted didn't really work for me, but Spinning Silver I thought was fantastic. Brandon Sanderson is next. Brandon Sanderson has written so many things, many of which I have read, and I like some, of course, way more than others. So it's not necessarily as easy to define this work versus this work, because, of course, if I were to do a tier ranking, I have some that would be at the top, some that wouldn't. But I really want to mention Steelheart for a second, because I've said before, if Steelheart was the first thing by Sanderson that I had ever picked up, I don't know if I'd have picked up another book by Sanderson. I don't like Steelheart. I think that Steelheart is maybe my least favorite thing by Sanderson, because there are other things I don't like as much as certain works. So as an example, I do like First Era Mistborn a lot. I like Way of Kings, especially. I love Way of Kings. Way of Kings I think is amazing. Wind and Truth, don't like it as much. If we're talking about Stormlight specifically, I don't like Second Era Mistborn as much as First. I liked Warbreaker. I like Warbreaker more than Elantris. You know, like there's varying tastes across the many works, but Steelheart, I'm just like, the story plays out as far as the plot progression, even though the plots themselves are different, the plot progression is so similar to Mistborn. Like, you can map out almost like exact, you think this is going to happen, and then it turns out this happens, because, like, I read Steelheart after having read Mistborn, and I predicted almost everything that happened, and nothing was a surprise to me, because I felt like, even though it was a superhero type of story, that it was so similar to Mistborn, weirdly, that I was never all that surprised. I also felt like, even though I really love Vin in Mistborn, and there are various different characters across the Cosmere who I think are awesome, the ladies in Steelheart were just kind of there to be hot and gawked at, and I was like, what is this? And I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand Steelheart. Skyward's fun. I like Skyward, you know, I'm mentioning Skyward because I want to be clear. It's not because it's not Cosmere, and it's not because it's young adult. I also really like The Arithmetist, too. I think The Arithmetist is delightful. I think it's really fun. So, Steelheart is just a big swing and a miss for me. Not a fan. Shifting now to Rebecca Ross. For this particular author, I have read The Letters of Enchantment, which the first book would be Divine Rivals. That is a series where I absolutely understand the hype. I thought it was incredibly moving. I thought it was eccentric and charming and devastating all at once. And I've read the first book in her adult fantasy duology that starts with A River Enchanted. And then I haven't yet read A Fire Endless, but I plan to hopefully very soon. And I quite liked that one. I did try reading, actually before any of these other ones, a previous work by this author, The Queen's Rising, I believe is the title, and I didn't dislike this one necessarily. I just found that the way the plot was progressing, it started to feel like more should have happened for the way that the character was feeling about certain things. So as an example, a character is starting to get to know somebody, and then later on it feels like all of a sudden they really love each other. And it was odd because it wasn't exactly insta-love. It was more of like we were supposed to have scenes happen. This is how I'm describing how I felt anyway. I'm not saying this is actually how it was, but it felt as though we had some things happen and then later they have strong feelings for each other, and it felt like I had a chunk of the story missing. And it wasn't just for those two characters, it also applied to some other individuals the character got to know. It had almost this found family feeling, where certain things happened, and then the character was like, oh, thank goodness, because you're like family to me. You're all like family to me. And I was like, how, though? I don't know if I feel like the found family, and just in general, the development of the relationships felt as earned. It a little bit leaned into, even though I think this phrase gets overused, kind of the show don't tell. It kind of felt like you were telling me that this is how she felt, but I didn't feel I was shown enough evidence where those feelings necessarily made sense to me. That is, of all the ones I think I'm looking at today, the one that I could see myself most likely going and trying again, because of the fact that I didn't have I had kind of just lukewarm feelings as opposed to, oh no, this didn't work for me kind of feelings. Next up, and kind of an author that prompted this, would be Joe Abercrombie. I love Age of Madness. I don't know if all of you know that. I think Age of Madness is really good. I didn't care for the Devils at all. I really didn't care for it. I appreciated what it was going for. And this one, if it's not clear, is a perfect example of what I mean as far as I appreciate the chance that was taken. Because while I do feel like the humor, there are some similarities in the kind of humor, I definitely felt like we took the humor from his previous works and we dialed it up to the loudest it will go. And that just, for me, took away, because I kind of like the more understated, dry humor where sometimes you don't even, it takes you a second to realize something funny was said, as opposed to constantly having the same thing over and over and over again, and that being the majority of the dialogue also. I had mentioned in my video where I was going in depth about the Devils that a character goes, oh my god, and how she says it so much, and that they feel the need to tell you she's saying it. It's written out, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, all the time. I had multiple friends of mine who did, because I said I wish I had a digital copy so I could look up how many times this is used. I think it was used at least, it was 63 or 67 times over the course of only some of the book, because it's a cast of characters, so you're only ever actually following her, the specific character that goes, oh my god. You're only following her for parts of it, because it's a lot of different perspectives. So you only, if you were to take the amount of perspectives that are hers, obviously you would trim the page count down. And then when it's established, she says, oh my god, about being frightened about things, that starts happening, I don't want to say exactly halfway through the book, but it's a fair amount into the book that starts to be established as a thing that she says. So when you actually, it's rather than taking the length of the book or the amount of words that are in the book in total, instead of taking that number, you'd have to just look at the amount of times that she has words dedicated to her perspectives. So for her to say, oh my god, that many times, it's so much. And anyway, the point is that I feel like that captures the point I'm trying to get across, that it was exceptionally repetitive and it was kind of the same jokes told oftentimes. It was the same dialogue used a lot of the times, and it wasn't my favorite. It wasn't my favorite. But I appreciate the jump. I do. I appreciate going for it. I appreciate the over the top, satirical, gory, violent. And I do actually feel like this is kind of maybe developing into a new trend of utilizing the horror genre and gore and extreme violence and kind of tapping into camp and profound themes. I think that we're starting to see more of this. And I can't tell if I'm just not a fan of this at all across the board, or if I just haven't seen it done in a way that I like. I will pay attention to that as I maybe check out more things that are leaning into exceptional amounts of violence and gore and sometimes horror leanings. I'll have to assess as I read on, because this could very much just be I don't like this kind of style of storytelling and genre blending. Last for today, we have Julie Kagawa, and Julie Kagawa wrote the Shadow of the Fox trilogy. Recently reread that trilogy and am happy to report I liked it even more on reread. I really like that trilogy, and I think that the story, why it works better on reread, is because there are certain things that you discover later in the series that then when you reread it, you see all the hints of those things along the way that you had no chance of knowing the first time you read through it. So it definitely has great reread factor to it. It's a lot of fun. It's this story that follows this young kitsune, half human girl named Yumeko. Yumeko has been tasked with protecting this piece of a scroll that if the pieces of the scroll are united, then when the dragon every 1,000 years comes back, it will grant the person who has the scroll a wish of theirs. And it has dictated much of how the world has played out up to this point. There are a lot of really evil people that want the scroll. There are a lot of people that want to try and prevent the scroll from ever getting into anyone's hands so that nobody can utilize the dragon's wish. And Yumeko kind of suddenly has this task thrust upon her, And then there is somebody from a shadow clan named Tatsumi who is tasked with finding the scroll, or at least a piece of it. And when he meets her, she tells him she knows where the scroll is and she needs to get there, and she'll lead him there, but he needs to protect her along the way. He doesn't know that she actually has a piece of the scroll, and she is just desperately trying to keep herself safe and keep hidden the secret that she has. And it's so fun. The Japanese folklore in this is incredible. The monsters in this are great. I think if you're somebody who appreciates, for example, in a lot of Elden Ring and those games in general, a lot of their inspiration comes from something like Berserk, which is a manga series, and a lot of the inspiration from that, of course, has some of its origins in Japanese lore as well. So you can see where there's kind of overlap, where if you like some of the monsters in those things, then there's a chance that you'll like some of the monsters in Shadow of the Fox trilogy. It kind of just feels nostalgic and action-packed. It's a fun time. I tried, after reading that series, to pick up the Iron Fae series, and I actually really liked the opening of the first book of that, and then as it progressed, it was not working. What I was describing about the Rebecca Ross work, where it kind of starts to feel as though we don't have all the pieces we need for the characters to feel the way they feel about things, I feel like that was definitely the case with that story. It kind of was just, we met and then all of a sudden we're in love. That kind of feeling. And that was not necessarily for me. That's it though for some authors who some of their books work for me, others didn't necessarily work at all. I would love to know, when has this occurred for you? What are some series that you've read that you adored and then you picked up something else and it didn't end up at all meeting your tastes? Thanks so much for watching though. I hope you have a great rest of your day and I'll see you later. Bye.